We are thrilled to host three wonderful panelists this evening, and I expect we will all learn a great deal from them about genetic tests, what they are, what information they can and cannot offer, how they shape our views of disease and disability, and what they tell us about our desires, perhaps even our compulsions, to predict and control human futures. If you aren't already on our mailing list and would like to hear about other events, please sign up on our website. We will be wrapping up our science theme at the end of this academic year, but we are hosting two public events during the next month that might interest you related to the theme. There will be a talk on April 29th by Alondra Nelson titled "The Social Life of DNA, Race, Reparations, and Reconciliation After the Genome." Nelson is president of the Social Science Research Council and Harold F. Lindner, chair and professor at the Institute for Advanced Study. She is now also the deputy director for Science and Society in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. I'd like to say a quick thank you to my wonderful colleagues on the Wayne Moore Center team, Thea Croman, Rebecca Dinwoody Flynn, Abby Stilley, Dan Titchener, and Christine Waite. We are grateful for support for this evening's event through the Lorwin Lectureship on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, and we are especially grateful to the many members of the Wayne Moore Circle who are here with us this evening. Circle members provide critical support for our programs through annual donations in any amount, from very small to large. Please consider supporting our work by becoming a Wayne Moore Circle member. We are celebrating our 20th anniversary this year and look forward to bringing programs like this to you for at least another 20 years. And now I'm happy to introduce my colleague Judith Eisen, professor of biology and distinguished scholar at the Wayne Moore Center this year. Professor Eisen will introduce today's panelists.
Thank you, Ellen, and I want to add my welcome to the members of our audience. I'm going to introduce our three panelists, and we'll let them all speak and then come back afterwards to field questions. So our first speaker is going to be Kathryn L. Murray. She is the Director of Genetic Services at the Center for Genetics and Maternal Fetal Medicine in Eugene, Oregon. She's been instrumental in bringing comprehensive genetic counseling to Eugene. She's been active in the System Ethics Committee of Providence Health and Peace Health Systems and was the on-site principal investigator in the BRCA1 predisposition testing program at Harvard's Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. At the University of Michigan, she aided in the verification of genetic markers for the Huntington disease gene. Our second speaker will be Alice Wexler, who is the author of The Woman Who Walked into the Sea, Huntington's and the Making of a Genetic Disease, which won a 2009 book award from the American Medical Writers Association. She's also the sister of Nancy Wexler, leader of the team that discovered the Huntington's disease gene, and a central figure in Alice's book, Mapping Fate, a memoir of family, risk, and genetic research. Our third speaker will be George Estreich, who writes about the intersection between new biomedical technologies and disability, including the shape of the eye, a memoir about his daughter, Laura, who has Down syndrome. His most recent book, Fables and Futures, Biotechnology, Disability, and the Stories We Tell Ourselves, was a finalist for the Oregon Book Award and was named a Best Science Book of 2019 by NPR's Science Friday. After our three speakers, we'll field questions from you, the members of our audience. We anticipate having plenty of time for questions, so please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and let us know what your questions are. So I'd like to start out by welcoming Kathryn Murray.
All right, welcome. Sorry for that little bit of technology glitch there. Thank you for inviting me to participate on this panel. I've enjoyed meeting all of you, especially Alice and George. I have a special connection with her sister, Nancy. Let's get started here. Genetics, what is it? What an enormous topic. Is it DNA, genes, chromosomes? Is it concrete concepts like recessive inheritance, or dominant inheritance? Is it the abstract hope for a cure? Is it the answer to all questions, or just the beginning? The hope of medicine is to alleviate suffering, but I like to remind myself that a cure is not always fixing something. Is genetics a Pandora's box, opening questions we have not even yet imagined? I think it's all of these things, including some of the mysteries and some of the answers. In my 30 years in the field, I've seen so many changes. I am the clinician on the panel tonight. I am in the trenches with individuals, families, and other health professionals. I explore life-altering questions and decisions in real time. I cannot believe somebody's calling. Sorry. I will share, my co-panelists will continue to explore the genetics of tests and human futures. Cures for disease is the holy grail of medicine, but outright cures rarely exist in my world of genetics. Ultimately, as a genetic counselor, I hope to help people find peace with their questions and eventual decisions, and I'll give you some examples today. In other words, to live with this information. Some of the elements of genetic counseling are scientific information, and I plan to spend the bulk of today's my time explaining some genetic information to you so that you can better understand what Alice and George are going to talk about. Some elements of genetic counseling are scientific information, exploring the values and beliefs of our clients, and facilitating decision-making. I am the clinician that brings these elements together. I bring context and perspective to find a path that one can live with. Genetic tests and human futures. I think this title really says it all, at least the hope for so many. The phrase at first pass sounds so simple, straightforward, a linear concept, right? A cause and effect. But do genetics really foretell human futures? We will explore this today. I know we all know it's not that simple. However, every day I meet individuals who expect that of genetics, of me. Lay people and professionals alike tell me that their genetic test was normal, implying that the person, the baby, is fully, wholly healthy, but it's not that simple. I will never forget the answer to this question that I gave to a patient when she came into my office. I asked her simply, "Why are you here today?" And she looked at me and she said, "Why am I here today? It's going to see how long I'm going to live so that I can make my plans for the rest of my life." Truly. She said this emphatically with a pound of her fist on the table. This desire for information, for certainty, and maybe the possibility to affect the future, I believe, is why in part companies such as 23andMe are so popular. Genetic testing is complicated, but it is binary. Decisions need to be made. There is yes or no, there is this or that. Rarely can we actually compromise when we come to these kinds of decisions. What are genetic tests and what information do they offer? I'm going to share my screen here. Screening. I want to give you some of the scientific background. I'm going to review a few things about screening tests and about diagnostic tests and about predisposition or pre-symptomatic testing. NIPT. It's a relatively new test. It is the fastest test to ever go from the research table to clinical use to coverage by insurance. What it does is it gives a woman an estimated risk that her baby may or may not have conditions like Down syndrome or severe conditions like extra 18 chromosomes or extra 13 chromosomes. How it works is that it, let's see, there we go. How it works is that they count fragments of DNA in the woman's blood. About 90% of these counts are from the woman, and about 10% of these counts are from the fetus. And what they try to do is to see if these counts are in proportion. If they are in proportion, then the person gets a low risk. If they're out of proportion, then the person gets a high risk. And this brings up the concept of positive predictive value and negative predictive value. Now remember, this NIPT that's being measured from the baby is actually placental cells. So we're using that as a proxy for the baby. Positive predictive value means the test is increased risk. Maybe it says out of 4 women who have that result, 3 of them might have a baby with that chromosome problem. The important part is that 25%, 1 in 4 do not. So the blood test is not a diagnostic test. Negative predictive value, what that is a measurement of if the test is normal, how sure are we? So for example, a typical normal result might say there's a 1 in 10,000 residual risk that we're wrong, and that baby really has that condition. The next topic I want to talk about is pan-ethnic carrier screening. I want everyone to remember that nobody has perfect genes. All of us are carriers for genetic conditions. And what I'm thinking about here are those recessive genetic conditions, meaning that a person is healthy. They have 2 copies of a gene, one from their mother, one from their father, and one is broken and one works, but that person is healthy. And if a couple gets together to make a baby and they are carriers of different conditions, then I'm not worried about that baby at all. It's only the occasional couple who is a carrier of the same condition. And then the baby receives 2 copies of the same gene and they are both broken. Some examples are things like cystic fibrosis or some muscular dystrophies or Tay-Sachs disease, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a minute. It is parental DNA, so you can even do it before somebody's pregnant. In summary, it's a risk assessment of the couple's risk to have a baby with a particular genetic condition. Now I want to talk about, I do want to mention this, so I thank myself for the slide there. Genetic testing has gone through multiple revolutions over the last year, or evolutions over the last year. And one of the big things is that it has allowed us to do something called next generation sequencing. And what that means is that we can take blood samples from multiple people, put them in the same machine, in the same run, and look at multiple genes for those multiple people. Hence, you can see all of this. Oops, sorry about that. We can see all of this information that's here in the slide. It's just to show you how complex it is. But what that has done is it has reduced the cost greatly. Only 10 years ago, it would cost over $1,000 to do 1 gene. The typical pan-ethnic carrier test I use has 175 genes, which would have been over $100,000 worth of testing. Now it's in the hundreds of dollars. What I always say to patients is we don't do a test just because you can afford it. There's purposes for it, and we'll talk more about that here today. Now I would like to talk about diagnostic tests. The first one I want to talk about is ultrasound. Ultrasound of a baby here lets us look inside the woman's womb and see different characteristics of the baby. Ultrasound itself can be a screening test, but it can also be a diagnostic test. An example that I think about is a baby with a complex heart defect. If a baby has a complex heart defect, whether or not they have a chromosome problem, that information can help us decide where to deliver that baby, when to deliver that baby, and how to deliver that baby. For example, in Oregon, the pediatric surgeons are in Portland, which is up in the top corner of the state, far away from many parts of the state. Then we have some diagnostic tests. The first one I just want to brief you on is called chorionic villi sampling. And what that means is that we get a little sample of the placenta. So in this picture, you see the ultrasound. This is the vagina, the cervix, and this is the little pregnancy in the placenta. A doctor uses ultrasound to look through the abdomen and then looks through the vagina and inserts a thin sterile plastic tube and takes a little pinch of that placenta. And then we could take those cells to the laboratory and we could actually look at the chromosomes. Amniocentesis is a little later in pregnancy. And by that time, the bags of water around the baby are fused. So it ends up being a nice clean poke. And we watch with ultrasound, there's a lot of room in there. Babies are not jumping around like 2-year-olds. They're actually like weak ballerinas in water. So the test is relatively safe. There is a small risk that the uterus could be, or the bag of water could be irritated enough that a woman could go into labor and miscarry. With amniocentesis, that's maybe 1 out of 500 procedures. With CVS, it's probably less than 1 out of 100 procedures. That risk means that we are not cavalier about the test, but it also means we're quite comfortable with it. I'll give some examples about why people might want to have definitive answers. And amniocentesis, CVS, even ultrasound can be definitive enough that parents might consider what it means to still stay pregnant. All right, I'm going to end the slideshow. All right. The risks of amniocentesis and CVS are relatively small compared to other medical procedures. However, for some individuals, it's too much. So even making a decision about diagnostic testing is often difficult in these individual situations. The last part that I want to talk about is predisposition or pre-symptomatic testing. Predisposition testing is where we are looking to see if somebody has an inherited characteristic that puts them at higher risk. The ones I think of easily are those inherited cancer genes. Now, let me just say for everybody that not all families with cancer have an inherited factor. In fact, most are sporadic, but a few families, estimated to be maybe 10% of families, actually have an inherited gene that make it easier to get cancer. The gene doesn't actually cause cancer, it just makes it easier. And that's a predisposition, meaning that it's not a foregone conclusion that that person will get cancer. And then there is pre-symptomatic testing. This is looking for a genetic change that if you live long enough, you will have that condition. In genetic terms, that's called fully penetrant. Cancer genes are reduced penetrance. Huntington's disease is an example of a condition where the gene is fully penetrant. It affects both the cognition as well as movement disorders. And Alice is going to talk a lot more about it, but I just wanted to define those terms today. You know, I've been leading up to talking about the consequences of genetic tests. An example for NIPT, that's that non-invasive prenatal testing where we measure fragments of DNA floating around in the maternal blood. Every day, I meet lay people, pregnant women, fathers, even doctors who think of it as the gender test. Now, and I have to disagree with that word in general. Gender is totally different than the sex chromosomes, but it does give us feedback about sex chromosomes. And it's interesting to note that the first company who put it on the market did not give sex chromosome information because they did not want it to become this entertainment test. And but there are clinical times when knowing information about the presence or absence of a Y chromosome are helpful. For example, if it looks like the baby's genitalia through ultrasound is ambiguous. Now, when I think about these tests, the layperson thinks about the gender. I think about their consequences of the test. Some tests are normal. It doesn't mean the baby's normal. It means that the risks for Down syndrome, trisomy 13, trisomy 18 are all very low. There are abnormal results, which many people think means the baby is abnormal, but in reality, it means that the risk is high enough to think about CVS, amniocentesis, and ultrasound. Believe it or not, there's actually sex chromosome abnormalities, which can have fertility issues and medical implications for that person as they grow and develop. And probably the hardest of all are atypical results, meaning there's something suspicious to the laboratory. It doesn't all kind of add up on the gut level, but they don't even know where to direct us, where to look. And some of those times we're thinking it's more likely the baby, and we're talking about amniocentesis and CVS. Sometimes it actually provides implications for the pregnant woman herself, because those fragments, most of them come from her. In fact, 90% do, and about 10% come from the pregnancy. Ultimately, the consequences of this test can lead to discussions after diagnostic testing about continuing the pregnancy, about ending the pregnancy, and even adoption is a real possibility, especially for children with Down syndrome. And those are very difficult conversations to have, and I have them every day. I think that why I'm willing to do it is because I am willing to be there and be in the trenches and help them find something that they can live with. I want to give you a quick story. Dr. Kabak is a physician who ran a laboratory in the 70s and 80s. In his laboratory, one of his colleagues had a baby with a devastating disease called Tay-Sachs disease. It's more common in the Ashkenazi Jewish population. And Tay-Sachs disease, the enzyme doesn't allow cells to break down waste products, and they build up in the nerves. So these children seem okay until about 6 months of age. And then they start losing their ability to see, to sit up, and we often lose them by 3 to 4 years of age. 40 years later, we still don't have any treatment. But Dr. Kabak, with his colleagues and their friends, they learned that many families would forego having any children because the risk was 25%. So he developed a way to actually tell who was a carrier. And it is more common in the Ashkenazi Jewish population. So through the synagogues, they were able to offer carrier testing. And in the end, there were about 700 couples who were at risk, most of which were planning on no children or no more children. Once he understood this about the enzyme, once he pioneered prenatal diagnosis through amniocentesis, there were over 2,400 pregnancies. And I may not have the numbers exactly right, but I got the spirit right. Out of those 2,400, about 1,800 children were born and healthy. Yes, there were some that were ended, but there were 1,800 children born who would never have been born if we didn't have prenatal diagnosis available. Now, how do individuals, families, and clinicians navigate the testing process? Well, there is direct-to-consumer testing. I'm not going to talk a lot about that today, but most of the time I think about it more as entertainment genetics. I do not think the subtleties of genetics can be conveyed in a paragraph on a website, but you can ask questions about that if you want. There are face-to-face appointments, which is the ones that I cherish the most because I'm often talking about life and death things. And it's so important to have that trust in one another. Trust that I can talk to them and trust that they can say things to me and try them out on me. And then when I think about navigating testing, you actually have to remember that there are very different levels of genetic knowledge, even within the medical profession. And, providers are individuals too. They can have misconceptions. And the subtleties of genetics can be lost on professionals also. Now, how do tests shape our understanding of disease and disability? Very carefully. There's a continuum, and I think George and Alice will help us explore this in more detail today. But when I think about disease, disability, making decisions, continuing or ending, I think about what patients tell me are some of the most difficult things for them. And these are not the same things for everybody. Some people think pain is the most difficult thing to live with. Others think that not having the cognitive ability to make your own adult decisions is too difficult. Some think not having biological children is very significant. Some think cognitive decline, such as dementia, is the worst. As we find ways to adapt, the disability may become more manageable, and the differences between disease and disability may become less clear. I'm going to give you a quick example for us today. This is a family who I met many years ago. They were young 20s. We did an ultrasound. We saw abnormalities. They had an amniocentesis. Their baby had trisomy 13, which is an extra 13 chromosome. And this extra chromosome causes very severe dysfunction in the brain and in the body functions. And the first bridge I had to cross with this couple is to talk about their thoughts about continuing or ending the pregnancy. Really early on, the couple was quite clear that they wanted to continue. And one of the reasons I kind of pushed a little bit to explore both is not because I had a preconceived idea what they should do, but because I wanted them in those dark moments down the road, late at night, when they wondered if they did the right thing, that they knew that they actually explored all the options and they made the best decision they can. And I think there's comfort in that. They continued the pregnancy. I met with them multiple times. When we started getting into the third trimester, we decided to meet with a high-risk pediatrician doctor called neonatologist. And one of the first topics for discussion is whether or not to put the baby in life support after it's born. Trisomy 13 is severe enough that we usually lean away from medical intervention and allowing those babies to have what time they have with their family. The family really believed me, but they didn't seem to believe it was going to be their reality. So after a lot of trust and a lot of talking, what I learned is that they were hopeful that God was going to grant them a miracle and fix the baby. Now, I think miracles happen every day. I really was not expecting it here. But I also didn't want their faith to be destroyed, and I wanted them to take an active role in this. So we talked about what it would mean to them if the miracle was not granted. And I encouraged them to talk to their clergy about that, because we all know that miracles do not happen every day. That's why we call them miracles. And then the discussion about whether to put the baby on life support was still there. And so then we were able to move on and talk about what signs would they need to see to know that God did not grant their miracle. And their first reaction was, well, we need to give God as much time as we can. And then we talked about, well, if the miracle is going to happen, why is there a timetable? And so what was eventually decided is if the severe cleft in the face was actually there, then they would know their miracle was not granted. And then they would spend all the time they could with their baby, not hooked up to machines. What also happened is the young parents had their own parents come from out of town and be there at the delivery. They spent a week with their adult children, but their children and their grandbaby. And it was actually a very beautiful time. I think that the counseling helped them come to a place that they could actually enjoy the little time they had after their baby was born. Now, a few more thoughts. What does it reveal about our desire to predict and control the future? I don't know. Isn't that a desire of all humans to predict and control and adapt our future? What does it mean to be fully human? I don't know, but I think it means being imperfect, having compassion for the quest for perfect, and finding imperfection in our path. What burdens are too much? That's individual. Learning to live with the hand we are dealt with grace and willingness to adapt is what I hope for, what I call finding peace. So I hope this is helpful. I look forward to answering questions, and I believe that it is Nancy who's going to talk to us next. So I will mute myself.
Can I start here? Am I on? Okay. Actually, it's Alice, not Nancy. That's my sister. Hello, everyone. And thank you to Ellen Herman and the Wayne Moore Center for the opportunity to speak on this panel. So I'm going to speak, continue what Kathryn was talking about genetic testing, specifically from the perspective of Huntington's disease, and specifically about predictive or pre-symptomatic genetic testing, which in Huntington's has been the most vexed and difficult kind of testing, this prophecy for the future. So I'm going to speak from personal experience as a member of a family affected by Huntington's. My mother, maternal uncles, and grandfathers all lived and died with this disease. My father devoted the last 40 years of his life to advocacy for Huntington's research. And my sister Nancy, whose entire professional life as a neuropsychologist centered around advocacy and research on Huntington's, is now herself living with the symptoms. I'm going to speak as someone who chose not to get tested, and I'll speak as a historian who's tried to understand what the Huntington story might reveal about genetic testing more broadly, and how the social and cultural contexts of Huntington's have shaped the lived experience of the disease. So as Kathryn mentioned, Huntington's is a neurological, psychiatric, and cognitive disorder that was once known as Huntington's chorea. And popularly, it was sometimes called St. Vitus dance, even though St. Vitus dance can refer to many other conditions. The most dramatic symptom is the involuntary movements of the body, which is chorea, psychiatric changes, and cognitive losses that lead inexorably over a period of 10, 20, or even longer to death. It's transmitted as a single autosomal dominant gene, which is actually the gene at the Huntington's disease gene is when it's associated with the disease is an expanded gene. It's longer, but it's expanded like an accordion. And over a certain threshold of expansion, it causes the protein it produces to be toxic to the brain. So that if you have above a certain threshold of number of what are called CAG repeats, just repetitions of CAGs in the gene, you will almost certainly develop the disease if you live into the age range, which in case of Huntington's is typically in the 30s or 40s, but it can be much earlier. And sometimes it's much later too. To add to it, each child or parent with this expanded repeat runs a 50-50 chance of inheriting that expanded gene as well and the disease. And since people typically have their children before the advent of the symptoms, until a predictive test came along, there was no way for prospective parents to know whether or not they might pass on the disease. I'm going to try this sharing here and see if this will work. Predictive testing for Huntington's has been haunted from the beginning by the inescapable shadow of eugenics. Early 20th century eugenic leaders, such as Charles Davenport, used Huntington's chorea as ammunition in his campaigns for immigration restriction, sterilization, and laws against marriage for the so-called unfit. So let's see. The idea, he was interested in finding some kind of a way of predicting the illness in the future. So the idea was that if you could find some kind of fundamental difference between those who had the disease and those who did not, that could be used as a means of predicting which among the children of an affected parent at 50-50 risk were going to actually develop the disease. And from these early eugenicists' perspective, that would be a way to stop transmission because it would be possible to either persuade or compel these prospective parents not to have children. Which in the early days, actually, in the early 20th century, was tantamount to telling them not to marry, given that birth control was difficult to access and abortion illegal in the 20th century until 1973. But on the other hand, that other half who found out that they did not inherit the expanded gene could have families without worrying about transmission. This perspective, this advice not to have children really continued into the 1970s, with even the most compassionate neurologists and geneticists advising those at risk against having children, while geneticists searched for some kind of a biological marker that might differentiate those who are destined to become ill. In the 1970s, however, that attitude began to change for several reasons. First of all, the civil rights movements of the 60s and 70s challenged eugenic practices and beliefs more generally. Genetic counseling programs started, and genetic counseling as a profession started to emerge. And in addition, Huntington's family members entered the conversation and formed the earliest HD advocacy organizations to speak for themselves on behalf of people with Huntington's. First, there was Marjorie Guthrie, the widow of the great songwriter and singer Woody Guthrie, who died with Huntington's. And then my father, Milton Wexler, and my sister, Nancy Wexler, along with many others, began to organize. And they also tended to agree that a predictive test was a useful goal, but for different reasons. First, it would be a huge advance for research toward a treatment, if you could identify these fundamental difference, whether it was genetic, biochemical, any kind of difference. But so far, up until the 70s, no marker had been found. But the family members were much more cognizant of the psychological and social costs of living with a predictive test, a positive predictive test for a disorder that could not be prevented and for which there was no treatment, much less a cure. And one for which many members of Huntington's families had traumatic memories of their relatives who had gone before them. So coming to a predictive test for somebody from a family that had meant coming often with the background of those memories. At the beginning of testing for Huntington started in 1986 through linkage testing. And access to the test actually was a major concern among Huntington's families, many of whom many members were eager to get tested as soon as the test became a reality. So at that time, the question of access loomed large. Where was it offered? It was only offered in a few centers. How expensive was it? Who would pay for it? And access remains a significant issue, actually, for genetic testing, particularly for instance, in parts of Latin America and countries where genetic testing is not readily available. So that can be a significant barrier for family members who do want to get this genetic test. But actually, although there was enthusiasm for the test in the beginning, over time, the numbers of people who have actually gone through predictive testing for Huntington's has remained relatively low. I believe less than about 20% of adults at risk in the United States. So if access was an issue on one side of the fence, on the other side of the fence were issues of coercion, pressures to get tested. There were discussions about whether employers and health insurers could require genetic testing, not just for Huntington's, but for other conditions, as more and more genes began to be identified. So in this regard, I've been interested in the language of predictive testing for Huntington's in the media, but also in the genetic counseling literature, in the genetics literature, and in medical writing, because the seemingly neutral language of description can so often shade into prescription and judgment. So in the early days of Huntington's testing, for instance, the media sometimes described the choice of testing as one between knowledge and ignorance. And who would knowingly choose ignorance? I think that's not an innocent way of describing the choice. Genetic counselors sometimes describe the test as offering a way to end the uncertainty and plan for the future. And these were the reasons that many people at risk themselves gave for wanting such a test, as Kathryn has described. And yet, there was no way to know just when symptoms would begin. So one kind of uncertainty could be relieved, but another kind, if you tested positive, another kind of uncertainty remained. I'm going to try sharing the screen again if I can. Here's a young woman who was one of the early people to get tested, Sally Spalding, who says, she knew instantly, there was never any doubt in her mind that she was going to get tested. And many people said that when the first test became available. Sometimes people were convinced they were going to get this disease anyway, and so then they might as well confirm it. But then she also wrote eloquently about the fact, that the worst part is watching and waiting. So the uncertainty did not go away. Now, in the last few years, and another issue was really for planning for the future was often very difficult when you were struggling to make the rent every month. So for those who were lacking in substantial financial resources, planning for the future, in the case of Huntington's, often turned out to be an elusive goal. In the last few years, actually, with the advent of clinical trials for treatments for Huntington's, including several forms of gene therapy, that has actually increased the pressures to get tested, to participate in the trials, especially since with a relatively rare disease, finding enough people to enroll in these trials can be a significant challenge. So now we have encouragement from drug companies and even HD advocacy associations to step up and do your part. But I think it's telling that even so enthusiastic a gene booster as the psychologist Steven Pinker, who advocates that we all volunteer to have our genomes sequenced and made public, did not want to know if he had inherited a higher than average risk for Alzheimer's disease. Now, of course, there are good reasons for getting a genetic test for Huntington's, including participation in research, and for the reasons that Kathryn has described. Certainly a negative gene test for many people has vanquished decades of anxiety and fear. And a positive gene test for Huntington's has spurred some people to really wonderful, creative, and innovative initiatives. For instance, founding the Huntington's Disease Youth Organization, or HDYO, based in the UK, but with a global reach. A website such as HD Buzz, which is a collaboration between a researcher who himself carries the expanded repeat and one who does not. And they translate, they provide excellent translations in multiple languages from technical scientific journals into lay language for the HD community. And another, a young woman tested positive, founded an arts group based in Paris, which has used Huntington's as the inspiration for theater performances, dance pieces, and very innovative research. Let's see. Oh. Research research on Huntington's and the knowledge of the users. This is their latest book, The Road of Possibility, the Huntington's disease in the hands of its users. And of course, the predictive genetic tests and advances in reproductive technology, such as pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, or PGD, have made it more possible for those who do carry the expanded repeat to have biological families in vitro. It's a form of in vitro fertilization without fear. And even doing so without having to learn their own genetic status, if they so wish, through non-disclosing PGD. So for many young people in the HD community, this possibility has been an enormous benefit and a source of joy. And I think it's important to remember in Huntington's that usually any individual person with a positive gene test has had multiple relatives with the same thing. The PGD also, though, once again raises questions about access, because it's expensive, difficult, not available everywhere, and it doesn't always work. It raises another question: does the possibility of prevention increase the stigma of the disease for those who are living with it? It raises questions, and we have new questions about what responsibilities do those who have Huntington's in the family bear toward their relatives and prospective partners to get a genetic test. Huntington's, I'm not sure Huntington's is a good model for thinking about predictive genetic testing or genetic testing more broadly, particularly because at the moment there's no medical benefit to predictive testing for the person being tested, no means of prevention. And it has, if you have above this threshold, you will definitely get the disease if you live long enough. But as we've learned also, even Huntington's can be a very variable disorder, with the age of onset varying widely. And so far, genetic testing cannot reveal this variation. So it could come on, quite late in life. To my mind, then, in conclusion, one of the takeaways from the Huntington's predictive genetic testing story is that just the complexity of such tests. If testing, even for so straightforwardly genetic and so obviously a disease like Huntington's, is so multi-layered. The story suggests that certainty may be an unrealistic goal, and that the meanings of genetic tests depend crucially on the social context. It suggests to me that genetic information is not always or necessarily useful knowledge. And with that, I'll stop and introduce George Estreich.
Thank you, Alice. All right. I want to also thank Ellen Herman for the invitation and everyone at the Wayne Morse Center. And I want to thank my panelists, Kathryn. I enjoyed meeting you. Alice, I've admired your work for years. And so it's a real pleasure to be here. Okay, I want to begin my talk with a quote, and it's one of the two epigraphs to my book, Fables and Futures, and it's from the writer and activist Marcia Saxton. And what she writes is, "What is wanted is a world where everyone is welcome." So today I'm going to focus on one of the tests that Kathryn talked about, NIPT. And just a quick review, that is a test that predicts the likelihood of chromosomal conditions, Down syndrome, and also sex from a maternal blood draw. I'm going to draw on my book, Fables and Futures, and I'll start by just talking briefly about that book to make my perspective clear. The book's premise is that powerful biotech compels a question of belonging. So at this point in history, we have ever more powerful tools to read and write DNA. That's a metaphor, of course, reading and writing. And IPT is a tool that quote, reads DNA. Those tools give us more power to select and possibly to shape future people. Given that power, we are confronted with choices about which bodies and minds are welcome. My interest in NIPT is a subset of that larger topic. It's one of the several different technologies I talk about in the book. Today, I want to focus on something specific, which is I want to look at the marketing attached to NIPT. But before I begin, I want to clarify an important point. So like Alice's, my investment in this subject is personal. I have a daughter with Down syndrome, now 20 years old. I would not be thinking about disability and technology, and even if I were, certainly not in the way I do, if not for Laura. But as a parent, to be clear, I have no interest in imposing the choices, the reproductive choices made in my family on other people. I would not deny anyone the test or judge the decision they take based on the information that test grants. I'm interested in the way we think about disability as a society, because the way we think affects the extent to which my daughter will belong. I am interested in the climate of assumption. NIPT is a for-profit product. Tests like Materna, T21 Plus, Panorama, and others, they are competing for market share. That means marketing, persuasion aimed at consumers and medical providers. So for my book, I studied websites aimed at consumers and specifically at prospective mothers. I studied their language and imagery, thinking about their explicit and implicit messages and the way their persuasion works. So I want to touch on some of the main patterns, and I want to begin with the way the test is named, non-invasive prenatal testing. Quick footnote, there's a shift lately to cell-free DNA testing, but non-invasive prenatal testing is still the main name that is used. So now, As the genetic counselor Robert Resta has pointed out, other screening tests like ultrasound are also non-invasive. So why highlight what the test doesn't do? And the answer is that the adjective non-invasive underpins an entire marketing campaign. NIPT has been consistently contrasted with amniocentesis and chorionic villus sampling, which Kathryn also talked about, both of which carry a small risk of miscarriage. So over the 10 years that these tests have been out, 10 years or so, especially in the early years, ads after ad touted phrases like no risk to your baby, and implying, without directly saying, that the test results provide certainty without risk. That impression of certainty is implied by the use of statistics in the ads. The number 99 is prominent, and the use of catchphrases like quality of science or the reassurance of knowing that suggest authority but are not actually verifiable in any way. Non-invasive is an objective sounding word with persuasive intent. That word to me distills the blur between information and persuasion that is characteristic of medical advertising in general. It is true, and Kathryn can speak to this as a genetic counselor, as someone in the trenches, as she said. So it's true that NIPT does not present a risk of miscarriage, but the contrast to say that it is safer than amnio or CVS is problematic. It may raise anxiety about a test that many women need. And the framing is misleading. NIPT is not an alternative to amnio. It is a screening test, not diagnostic. So for confirmation, a positive test will require an invasive test anyway. Now, in recent years, the ads have noted more prominently that this is a screening test, yet the contrast with amnio persists. So that's the terminology, just the way the test is named. But the websites are not just informational. They have images of women and families, and they seek to make an emotional connection with the consumer. So to me, studying them was an exercise in applying close reading, the way you'd read a novel or a poem, but to non-literary artifacts. And here were my main questions. Who is represented and how? How are human groups represented? What assumptions underlie the stories or the stories or the implicit stories told? What are the images of family, community, and belonging? I'm going to try to share my screen. Oh, no, the operative word is try. The Zoom gods are not cooperating. You're going to have to take my description of it, but I'm happy to post some links in the chat. Okay. Taken together, the ads tell a story about motherhood, technology, family, and success. Its main characters are attractive women in spacious homes. They do not appear to work. They listen carefully to their doctors and do lots of yoga. Their partners are always men who are invariably committed, sensitive hunks. The children are chromosomally perfect, and they seem to spend a lot of time in meadows. The doctors are authoritative but caring. It is a world of upper middle class homes, conventional sex roles, and scientific certainty. I call the style of the website sunlit clinical, the best of nature in the lab. They present images of a good American life with a technological assist. People with disabilities are, with only one exception that I've ever seen, not pictured. They are present as abstractions and statistics, as lists of conditions, each with its possible defects. The words used to describe them are typically abnormality, defect, and risk. It is not simply that in the websites, people with disabilities are unreal, is that they are an implied threat to a sunny world of reassurance, certainty, and health. And the test, by extension, is a way to protect that world. So I'm going to turn now to, this is an excerpt from the book, and it's about a program about the Today Show and a segment that aired in 2013. On January 28th, 2013, the Today Show profiled an expectant couple, Jason and Robin Wexler, who had recently opted for a brand new prenatal test, Sequinom's Materna T21 Plus, a non-invasive prenatal screen. Though nominally a human interest story, the segment was functionally an infomercial. The couple testified to the test's value, as did NBC's chief medical editor, Ms. Wexler's OBGYN, and the chief medical officer of Sequenom. No competing test was mentioned, and Maternity 21 Plus was compared favorably and repeatedly to, quote, invasive diagnostic tests. And the danger of miscarriage from amnio was emphasized. The couple shared their results on air, and a lot of people blogged about this at the time, where Matt Lauer said, let's get to the good news, and asked Ms. Wexler about her test results. She replied that the test was negative and that the family was, quote, safe. The Wexlers are real people, but they look like the couples portrayed in the ads. They are attractive, heterosexual, committed. The B-roll filmed in their home showed them to be well off. They were, in other words, a good portrait of the target market for an expensive test. But what interested me the most was the end of the segment, because this is where the complications of testing are truly exposed. Going into the show, the Wexlers knew that the test results for Down syndrome were negative, but didn't know the baby's sex. That's revealed live before the studio audience. The couple is handed a white box held shut with green and gold ribbon. They untie it, finding a pile of blue, boy-themed infant swag. The dad, until then silent but smiling nervously, pumps his fist and says, yes. The mom is more measured, but she asserts that she is definitely happy. Reality TV, from Survivor to The Bachelor to Dancing with the Stars, depends on contrived ritual. But even by those standards, this one is bizarre. The white box as proxy womb, the future child transmuted into gendered gifts, a ritual forecast and offering, birth and consumption, and cheerfully surrendered privacy. In a world of targeted distractions, this one is near genius. It translates a new unfamiliar technology to a human scale and renders it in familiar terms. Nice people opening a present. It's a persuasive bit, and it has several key features worth noting. First, it humanizes the technology, translating it into a familiar, easy to imagine interaction. Second, that interaction is both value-laden and emotionally charged. Health, family, and a future child are all at stake. Third, it abstracts that interaction from social context. It occurs, as it were, on an empty stage. It has stories' emotional resonance without the emotional complexity. And in a world where we are all struggling to make sense of new technologies, that very simplicity has its own appeal. Like most reality TV rituals, this one offers closure. A dancer is crowned, poor family gets the dream mansion, future wife is selected for the rose. And yet, the complexities keep spilling over the tidy boundaries of the form. In the online version of the story, the test results are described as, quote, good news on two fronts, unquote. It's troubling to see the good news of a fetus not having Down syndrome linked to the good news of that fetus being male, because whether these are, quote, good are not only matters of biology, but matters of value. For this reason, the presentation of a single story is misleading. Who could begrudge the Wexlers their happiness at a boy, their wish for a healthy child? But the Wexlers aren't the point. What matters is the way that pitches for new technology both absorb and reinforce societal norms. Chromosomally, the child is solidly male, XY, and typical, 23 pairs of chromosomes, no trisomies, and the family is nuclear, with two monogamous heterosexual parents. In the Today Show's rough arithmetic, a syndrome is a matter of health and gender is a matter of humanity. One is bad news, the other good. As it happens, the test can also detect conditions with atypical numbers of sex chromosomes, Turner syndrome, a single X, Klinefelter, XXY, triple X syndrome, and XYY syndrome. In other words, the test marks deviations from typical gender while being associated for profit with an example of a committed heterosexual couple welcoming a normal baby boy. So the ads have literary and artistic qualities, carefully chosen language, carefully constructed images. The ads are not literature or art. They do not explore unanswerable questions. They deliver pat answers. And unlike literature or art, they are not meant to be seen or remembered for themselves. In fact, on two levels, they speak their own erasure. I think the goal of the ads is to make themselves disappear. They want to dissolve in the short term into decision, into test uptake, and in the long term into routinization. I think that the goal was always to make testing automatic, a standard practice, for the test to become routine and the ads unnecessary. I think we're a long way towards that having happened. And researching this talk, I was surprised to find that the glitzy consumer-focused ads are far less prominent than they used to be. But this may only mean that the consumers have taken on the marketing themselves. So speaking with my friend Katie Stoll, a genetic counselor, I learned that a significant portion of the demand for NIPT is now driven by gender reveal parties. And this is confirmed by multiple sources, which is to say that couples anxious to know the child's gender early on, or the child's sex early on, excuse me, so they can throw a party early and feature it on social media, are demanding the test for that reason. There is, in fact, an NIPT that is aimed only at discovering sex called Peekaboo that actively markets to parents with this interest. And there's a blog post on their website, for example, with 10 gender reveal ideas to try. Looking back to the Today Show segment from 2013, we can see that the marketing was prescient, that at least one company was able to see the coming market and early reporting of sex. Interestingly, that TV segment also foreshadowed a trend by which customers for the product, in that case, the Voslers, become active participants in marketing. Now, by word of mouth, discussions in parent groups and on blogs, mothers and prospective mothers offer testimonials to the value of NIPT. In fact, a quick Google search revealed multiple blog posts about gender reveals, this video, that specifically mentioned NIPT. One, in fact, was sponsored by Panorama, by the company Natera's. It is possible to imagine a society in which an early accurate test for Down syndrome is not described as a, quote, holy grail, which is the way it was described when it was originally rolled out. It is possible to at least imagine a society whose priorities are different, where the flourishing of the real variety of bodies and minds is a primary goal, and testing and prevention is a secondary one. Even without the marketing, a prenatal test frames people with genetically based disabilities in problematic ways. It focuses on the genetic essence, not the lived life. It emphasizes a medical frame. It emphasizes diagnosis over individuality. It obscures the actual context of a life, from laws to insurance to the presence or absence of welcome. And it lumps unrelated conditions together under the idea of abnormality. But normal is a complicated idea, and disability, I believe, following those I've read in disability studies, is not merely a physical or genetic fact. It occurs at the interface of the body and the world. What then is an alternate frame? In narrative terms, what other story might we tell about disability, technology, and people? There is no one story to tell. There are many stories, and people with disabilities are telling them. Listening to Alice's presentation, I am struck again at the extraordinary variation in conditions that can be tested for. And of course, there's variation within those conditions too, both biological variation, as in the age of onset of Huntington's, and variation depending on, say, whether you have insurance, what your circumstances are, what community support you have. This is particularly true for Down syndrome. Over years watching Laura grow up, thinking and talking about her condition, I've become less willing to generalize. I would rather try to make room for her in the world. That means questioning the received categories that haunt us: normal versus abnormal, able versus disabled. It also means understanding that for Laura's happiness, the main issue is not chromosomal. It is the way the world understands and accommodates her, or fails to. By extension, that means that her future is linked to the futures of others who are marginalized and categorically dismissed. Ultimately, I go along with Alison Kafer, who's author of the book Feminist, Queer, Crip, who asserts that disability is not only a matter of the body, it is relational, it is a political and social identity. As Kafer writes, I think the inability to value queer lives is related to the inability to imagine disabled lives. Both are failures of the imagination, supporting and supported by the drive towards normalcy and normalization. Against this failure of imagination, Kafer argues for, quote, more accessible futures. And she writes, I am yearning for an elsewhere, and perhaps an elsewhen, in which disability is understood otherwise, as political, as valuable, as integral. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our speakers, Kathryn, Alice, and George. And it's now time to start asking some of the questions that have been asked by the audience. So for those of you who have questions, please put them in the Q&A. But let's see, I am going to start with one of the questions here that asks about the role of scientists in considering these kinds of tests. So are there organized groups of scientists who've responded to these kinds of genetic tests? Is there a divide between the scientific community and the disability community and the genetic counseling community? So I'm going to throw this open to all three of our panelists to start, and then we'll move on from there.
This is Kathryn. I think that geneticists have thought about this and wanted to be part of it from the very beginning. When the Human Genome Project was started, they have an entire dedicated arm to ethical issues and exploration of those and separate funding. I think that it gets much harder to, I don't know if the right word is control, when it's so accessible. And I think that in the area of assisted reproductive technologies, our government, the NIH, has stayed out of funding those things. So there's even less control if there isn't big funding and research arms. But to answer the question, I think that they have paid a lot of attention to it, but it's getting bigger now, and it's not just in the scientists' hands.
Alice or George, do you have any thoughts on this?
No, I don't know that I can really speak knowledgeably to that question. I do know in the Huntington's community, and I don't know how typical this is, maybe Kathryn has some idea about this, that the families have developed quite relationships with the scientists who are doing the research and have been I don't know if this is perhaps partly because of my sister, who was a scientist and a researcher, and there are several other people also who have been both, and so I think that in my personal experience, the scientists have been fairly sensitive to some of the issues about predictive testing for Huntington's, but they're also sometimes tend to have the attitude that they are the source of knowledge for the families, you know, and they will describe things in a somewhat more absolute way than some of us would like, actually. I'm not including you, Kathryn, but
well, I think physicians in general are very parental, and that's a big part of their training. I think geneticists, there's so many things we cannot affect and fix that I think that we've become true counselors in the sense, even medical doctor geneticists, because sometimes all we can do is to help the family deal with it.
Yeah, this is a little bit off the question. I mean, I think that this is a great example of how different conditions are, because, Huntington's, is organized around this kind of, the amazing heroic effort led by Nancy to kind of localize and discover this gene. I mean, this years long effort, and that there was consensus over the value of that. There's no similar quest that unites the Down syndrome community. There's some research going on into improving cognition, but that's a pretty controversial thing. Some parents are all down with that, some not so much. So there's not one unifying quest for a cure, because most of us are kind of cool with our kids as they are. So that's a huge difference. I think that a lot of effort has been done, and especially by people like my friend Stephanie Meredith, on bringing together different clinical groups in talking about, like, how, for example, do you deliver a prenatal diagnosis sensitively? How do you deliver a postnatal diagnosis? So, and getting together different kind of stakeholders in that, which is very difficult but important work.
So maybe continuing along that line a little bit, and based on what George just talked about, differences in maybe the perception of different communities. Are there places where maybe lines can be drawn? If you think about Huntington's disease or sickle cell or Tay-Sachs or Down syndrome, does the meaning of the genetic variation that we see in those communities and the resulting, I'm going to say in quotes, disabilities, as they are often perceived in our social system, is this primarily social and political?
This is Kathryn. I have a thought. I can think of one line drawn in the sand from the genetics point of view, and that's testing children for adult onset conditions. There's a pretty strong line in the sand about it. We do get parents who ask us of that, and most would not go through with that and test children for adult onset diseases. And I think the main reason is because we see adults react so differently to that information, that child who may not have to deal with it for 40 years should have their own ability to react to it, not embody or internalize their parents' reactions. So that's one line in the sand I can think of.
Judith, just to ask, so was the questioner asking about distinguishing between more and less severe conditions, like that kind of land? I like, because I think that overlaid with what Kathryn just pointed out is, like, when do you tell someone some kind of information, especially if it's about something that is uncertain but you can't do anything about it, as in Huntington's? When is someone ready to process? So is it kind of,
or thinking about different kinds of conditions, is there some sort of distinction that one might make, or based on biology, I'll say, or is that really a social or political distinction?
I would say, I don't think those two can be teased apart. One thing that was really great in our pre-discussions of this and getting to email with Alice a little bit was to say that on one hand, whatever line there is, I think Down syndrome and Huntington's are on different sides of it. That the overwhelming consensus, if I understand right, in the Huntington's community, is that this is a disease, and if it were completely eradicated from the species, that would be a-okay, and in fact is a desirable goal. Whereas the community around Down syndrome does not feel that at all. And most of us are trying to say this is a way of being human. So that's partly rooted in biology, but it's biology as filtered through identity. And to me, I think the break point is that Down syndrome is seen as a part of identity in Huntington's, and I'm learning from Alice's work here as a destroyer of it.
I will say I agree with George. I do think that for people in the Huntington's community, people who have it, who are at risk for it, who are close to those who have it, there has been a certain kind of embrace of an identity recently in the last 25 years, maybe. Even at the same time as people would like to have it eliminated from the face of the earth. I think it's kind of a double consciousness, really. Wanting to get rid of it, but on the other hand, like the ding ding dong people in Paris, who are really using it as they say, as a spark to the imagination, to try to think differently. And since it's here and it's not going to go away, even if there's a so-called cure, there are new mutations all the time, that occur also. So, and Huntington's, even though it's a kind of unique in certain ways, the different components of it are shared by other conditions as well. So I think in that sense, I think of it in a double way, because there is something that I've certainly embraced. I identify with this community. It has given me a lot in my life that, that I value. On the other hand, I don't have the disease. And, so I think about that sometimes too, the people who have it, the people who are in the same family who don't have it, and the inequalities there and how that plays out is very challenging. But it's not, there are some positive parts to it once you're faced with it. As Kathryn said, it's the hand you're handed, what you're given, and what you can do with it. And some of the things that people have done with it, even though they would prefer not to have had it, they have done some very creative things with it. That makes sense.
And Alice, I think about your sister in that way, and all the work she did to try to understand Huntington's, and I recently saw an interview, and obviously I don't know your sister very well, but that it really drove her scientific interest to understand this condition. And I don't know if we would know as much about it, or we would think as much about the ethics of knowing something before it can happen if it were not for your sister.
Thank you.
So there's a question from a member of the audience. I know that when prenatal testing reveals that an unborn child has Down syndrome, a significant number of parents decide to abort. So that, I guess that's the first part of the question. So we could talk about that. And then, is there something similar that happens with testing for Huntington's? So that's really kind of two questions.
I'd like to take the first part about that. There are published studies that say 98% of babies diagnosed prenatally with Down syndrome end up in ending the pregnancy. And that is certainly not my experience in this community. Those studies came from universities, and working in Los Angeles in the past, in New York City, I think people who came to prenatal diagnosis were much more prone to consider those things. So I think a lot of that is bias of ascertainment. Here in Eugene, I really started the genetics availability 30 years ago, and I brought it to providers and doctors as genetic counseling to see if they're interested in additional testing. And my personal experience is that about 50% of families would make that decision. So quite a few families do continue. And I've only had one family consider the option of adoption. I do bring that up for all the families. So I don't think it's all about ending the pregnancy. Sometimes it's about learning information and planning and preparing. Huntington's disease prenatal diagnosis, it does not happen very much at all because it's on the lines of childhood pre-symptomatic testing. I have been involved in cases where parents the choice is no children or having prenatal diagnosis and ending those affected pregnancies. And so for them, having a 50% chance to have a child who survived and was born was better than no children at all. So most of the time when prenatal diagnosis is done for Huntington's, it's really explored heavily ahead of time why is that information happening for the family. Real quick, I'll just do a real quick story. I had a family once who the father was at risk for Huntington's. He did not want predisposition testing. He did not know his wife was pregnant. She came to us asking us to test the baby, and if the baby was affected, she would end the pregnancy. And I had significant problems with that because that would mean she knows that he has the gene. And we talked greatly, and I frankly talked to her about what it would be like to lay next to this man and know this about him when he doesn't want to know it himself. And we came to a compromise. The testing was not done, but just to really think about that, one of my docs I work with, his first reaction was, the test is accurate, we can do it, and she's our patient, he's not. And my first reaction for him was, then you do it. And he's like, no, I don't want to do it without you. And I'm like, well, I don't want to do it. And I got ethics consults, and I had to really think about it in my own heart and tell the woman that I was not willing to participate in that. But instead of just making her feel bad about it, we actually talked about what it would look like to include him. And they got pregnant again. And this time she came in with him. And one of the options we talked about was to test the baby, but we did pre-symptomatic testing for him, counseling for him. And if the baby was affected, they would both know it and know that he has the gene. And if the baby was unaffected, he could still stay in the dark. And so that was my compromise for that family. But it's not done very often because most families are hopeful for a cure in 40 years.
Kathryn, while we're on this topic, I'd like to expand on a little bit. You touched on this, and Alice also touched on this, and what you just talked about really touched on this, the idea that when you are testing an unborn child using any one of the diagnostic type tests, at least, you're also testing other people in that family. And then, of course, this extends to existing people getting tested. And so if we talk about directed consumer testing, something like 23andMe, if I decide to get tested for something on 23andMe, anybody else in my family is also, for some of those tests or for some of that genetic analysis, will be revealed for certain conditions. So in your practice, how do you deal with something like this? And then I'd like to have Alice expand on that perhaps a little bit.
Well, just real quick, who I see, most of them, it's going to be a condition that affects the newborns. So it will be revealed soon after birth. Okay. So we're not really foretelling something that might happen 20 years from now. Conditions like Down syndrome are rarely inherited. So a lot of the things I work with are sporadic, and they don't tell me other things about family members. 23andMe, those predictive, those companies, I have difficulties with them, partly because I do not think they distinguish between risk levels. Everybody's high risk or everybody's low risk. I think that they use a completely different technology that can make mistakes in actually telling someone if they have a gene. And even my sibling, my full sibling, I only share 50% of those genes in common with them. So I don't know that I'm telling something about my sister. Huntington's disease is kind of different because if a 30-year-old is being tested to see if they have the gene, and it's their grandmother on their father's side who had it, if that 30-year-old has the gene, then we have said that the father has the gene. And that's a big part of the counseling about how families will handle that. And will they put off testing, or will they never tell their parent? So it does reveal things about families, and it is family diseases, but it's rare that we're actually revealing genetic information about disease for another family member.
Alice or George, I wonder if you have anything to add to that.
I can jump in, Alice, unless do you. So, I mean, I think that we're I think of this in terms of the marketing, which is a purely individualist pitch, like the idea of choice, like this is your choice. But, you know, genetics doesn't really go along with that. Genetics says we are connected by definition. And so the idea that you're going to find out something that is just true for you, it doesn't fit with the way biology works. And so I think we have a collision between an individualist model, which is more on the selling things side, and the way people are connected to each other. So, yeah.
Just real quick, I want to add that even shows up in our electronic medical records. I had to fight hard about how to include relevant information about family members in an individual's medical record. Because if I want to see if somebody has this mutation somebody else does, I have to have that family mutation. In fact, I send that report along with the sample so I don't make any kind of typo in transposing what the exact mutation is. So this individualized part of medicine goes against my grain completely. When I see a patient, I'm really dealing with a whole family, even if it's a not related person, like the father of the baby that isn't at risk for whatever disease. He's still an important part of the story.
You know, it raises a question in my mind about this individualism, how American, if this is somehow exaggerated in the United States with our strong individualist ethos more than the experiences in other countries. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, here's another question from the audience. We have an audience member who's interested in the issue of genetic testing in the workplace. So the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act of 2008 outlaws discrimination against workers by employers based on genetic information. But there's been very little litigation under the act over the last 12 years. Does this mean that it has successfully stopped employers from seeking genetic information about employees? And the question is, did the panelists feel there are compelling reasons for employers to have a freer hand seeking genetic information about their workers?
To me, the second question is easy to answer, and I would say no. But I don't know enough to answer about the effectiveness of that policy as opposed to the other factors in litigation. So I will bow out for someone who might know a little more than I, or a lot.
I think it depends on the company. And what I mean by that, and I know of no real example, but let's say you're going to pay a CEO millions and millions of dollars a year, and you're hoping for a 3-year run. You know, people have speculated, will they look at them for any signs of dementia? Let's say the average CEO is 65 years old. Theoretically, that can be done. It's not supposed to be done. I think it's unethical. I only know of one case personally, and it was reported to me by the woman herself, who let her boss friend know all her steps in her pre-symptomatic Huntington's disease testing. And within revealing that she was positive and she was a model employee, they found cause to fire her within 6 months. And she was a CEO and she had to make a lot of powerful decisions. And I don't even know if that was a conscious choice, but I think it, you know, if you look closely at anybody, you can find reasons to doubt them. Part of trust is to say, if I say one little thing wrong, that she didn't really mean that. And so I don't know if it made them look harder at her. I don't know if they had a personal stake in it. I don't know if there was shareholder pressure. I don't know, but her feeling was the information led to her not working anymore, but she volunteered it willingly. And I don't know that it hampered her in future jobs, because I don't know that anyone knew about that. But I think it's interesting about this dynamics of interpersonal dynamics between individuals.
There was a lot of discussion about, in the early days of Huntington's testing, well, what about airline pilots? Should an employer have the right to give them a genetic test, or police and in certain kinds of occupations like that? And we always argued against that because, airline pilots get medical tests or examinations clinically. I mean, that's what matters, is their performance. And we always felt that, the genetic test wasn't relevant, but their behavior was what mattered. So, but I don't know the history of the litigation either.
I think just a quick thing to add is never underestimate the power of a diagnostic frame, which is to say, once someone knows you have something, that something will be used to explain all phenomena. And this is just like with Kathryn, it may not relate, but once that's known, the stigma of that can be very hard to escape. And I tend to, with what Alice, what you were just saying, it's like if the functionality is an issue, it's like, are your reactions now too slow to pilot a plane full of people? You can test that directly. And the gene test actually doesn't tell you anything about whether someone is in that state at that time. So.
And then I also remember in the 1980s, early 80s, in life insurance companies, they actually bought the mailing list to magazines that catered toward gay men. And those men, just by being on the mailing list, were excluded from buying life insurance, and even affected health insurance. And that was pretty well documented. I wrote a paper about it when I was in college. But for them to go as far as buying the mailing list and excluding people on the mailing list was, it always reminds me that people can go too far.
So as we're winding this down, I'd like each of you to say something about what you're most worried about and what you're most hopeful about in relation to genetic tests.
For me, it's misinterpretation of the results and causing harm in some way. I think there is great risk of that. What am I hopeful for? Well, in my career, I've actually seen things come around to come close to curing individuals. I'll never forget a little girl that I saw a presentation about who had this terrible disease. It looked like a metabolic disease. We didn't know what it was. And her doctor sequenced her whole genome, found out what gene was broken. And this is an extreme example. And they were able to alter the metabolic pathway with medication. And so in this presentation, we saw her deteriorate terribly, and we saw her recover to her former self. And that's pretty powerful. I didn't know that I would see that in my lifetime, because genetics is so hard to treat.
George or Alice?
Sure. I'll go. I mean, just to follow up on my presentation, I would ideally like to see genetic tests delinked, separated from marketing, which is to say that, it's by definition, it's at odds with what genetic counselors are trying to do. And this is like talking with, hearing Kathryn talk is so amazing and helpful, because it just shows like that the pitch for simple and certain is just, it's false. It's always messy, positive, negative. It always gets human and messy very, very fast. And the overwhelming message is that I see attached to, and this goes for, drugs as well, is simplicity and certainty. And that in itself is a lie. But more than that, like the ideal, as I understand the ideal genetic conversation with a genetic counselor, it is open and it is open to the patient's values. It's non-directive, or that's the ideal, right? So
Yes.
advertising is covert and directive. It's the opposite of good medical practice. So as one start, I would like to see we desperately need many more genetic counselors for the avalanche of genetic information that's going to keep coming our way. Can I say that then? Less marketing, more genetic counselors who are sensitive to the realities of life with disability. I think that would be truly awesome.
Before you go on, Alice, I just want to do a little pitch here because I don't know who's listening, and we're with the Law Center. Genetic counselors are not paid for their services. All right, we're not incident to Medicare. If there's lobbying going on to try to the profession, I think, is well recognized, and what we do is well recognized, and even congressmen agree. But we have not been able to pass anything that says that we are able to bill in our own name. And I think that we might be able to bill a facility fee, okay? But the work that we do deserves to have the ability to make a living and to have more come out of school. There are no grants for genetic counseling programs. It has to do with politics. It has to do with this whole idea of abortion. We don't get any funding like nursing schools do or medical schools do. And if we could do anything, if there's anyone out there who can help in that area, I think that we would have enough genetic counselors. Believe me, there are plenty who apply. Maybe one out of, it's harder to get into genetic counseling school than it does medical school.
Well, I would second everything that both of you have said, and I think genetic counselors play an incredibly important role in the present and in the future of genetics. And also, I think the original question when you talked about your greatest fear and your greatest hope, this idea of marketing, but commercialization also of genetic tests, and that they should be for profit, that the tests are for profit rather than, and the counselors are not recognized in that way. My greatest hope, besides for more really compassionate and well-informed genetic counseling, I think it's for more understanding and more acknowledgement of the complexity of genetics, just as we've all been talking about, and how complicated it is, and how, what can I say? Well, I would say one other thing. I think that the diseased communities, like the Huntington's, and the disability community, I would like to see more interaction between them. Because I think even though they're so different in many ways, the disease community has a lot to learn from the disability community. And I think that we ourselves haven't reached out enough in that way. And I hope to see more of that kind of interaction around genetic conditions with the disability community.
So I guess I'm going to bring this to a close by saying, as someone who firmly believes that we all do a better job of whatever it is we do if we're talking to all the other people who might be interested and somehow associated in some way, more interactions between the scientific community, the disease community, the disability community, the genetic counseling community, the law community, the physician community. I think all of those would go a long way towards bringing all of these things together in a way that would make it more helpful and more hopeful for a lot of different constituencies. So I want to thank everyone, Kathryn Murray, Alice Wexler, George Estreich. I think this has been really informative, very interesting, a lot of food for thought, and really excellent presentations. I hope everyone comes away from this as interested and excited as I am, thinking about all of these things and thinking about all the possibilities out there and the potential for getting involved in thinking about these things. So I am now going to turn it back to Professor Ellen Herman.
Thank you so much, Professor Eisen. And I just want to echo Judith's thank you to all of our panelists. Here at the Moore Center, we are all about conversations and questions about issues that matter. And I can hardly think of an issue that matters more than the one we've been talking about and hearing about and thinking about this evening. So thanks again to all of our panelists. Thanks to each and every one of you who have been with us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you at a future Wayne Moore Center event. Good night.
Thank you.